Hi, I'm Pastor Diane of the Living Hope Presbyterian Church in Clifton, New Jersey. Happy Memorial Day, and I'm glad you're joining me for this Monday Musing. Today I'm beginning a series of reflections on the Old Testament book of Esther. I've been intrigued for quite a while by the story of this young Jewish woman who became the queen of Persia. First, a little background on the book itself. Esther is one of two books of the Bible named for women. The other is Ruth, the woman who became the great-grandmother of King David. The book of Esther was one of the last to be accepted into what's called the canon, the scriptures considered authoritative by the early Christian community. The fact that God is not mentioned in the book is one of the reasons why many didn't believe that Esther belonged in the canon. Some historians consider Esther to be a fictional account because it lacks references to known historical events. However, many Jews and Christians consider the story a true historical event, especially those Persian Jews who believe Esther to be one of their ancestors. Esther records the origins of the annual Jewish feast of Purim, the commemoration of the saving of the Jewish people living in Persia. These people were part of what was known and is known as the diaspora, the Jews living outside of Israel. And these are the ones who remained there in Persia after their people were allowed to return to their home country following about 100 years of exile in Babylon. The Jewish people who remained in Persia had established homes and a lifestyle in that country, so probably preferred to stay where they'd put down their roots. Those are just a few tidbits of the history of the book, and you can always Google to find more of them. Well, the first chapter of the book of Esther sets the stage for the rest of the story. We're introduced to King Ahasuerus, who ruled over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Here in the royal palace in Susa, he's holding a banquet for all his ministers and officials, the army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and governors of all the provinces in his kingdom. And he's doing so to celebrate the third year of his reign and to showcase his great wealth. We are told the party went on for 180 days. Can you imagine? I imagine that those in attendance were suitably impressed by the king's extravagance. And through the party, the king hoped to cement his hold over these important leaders of his kingdom. Following this extravagant party, the king turned his attention to the citizens of the capital by throwing them a 7-day party. All were invited to the palace to see the opulence of the king, and everyone ate and drank to their heart's content. The king's hold over his kingdom and his people, particularly the men who were invited to this banquet, increased. We're also introduced in chapter 1 to the queen, Vashti, who at the same time that the king was holding his 7-day banquet for the citizens was holding her own banquet for the women so that they too could experience the grandeur of the palace. I think that the queen knew who had the greatest influence in the kingdom. In the second part of chapter 1, the queen takes center stage. On the final day of the party for the citizens, the king demanded that Queen Vashti come to the banquet so that he could show off her incredible beauty, and the queen refused. Imagine the uproar. But why she refused is unclear. It could be that she felt the request was unwarranted, as it was so unusual for a queen to be summoned for that purpose. This seemed to be probably a more appropriate request for one or more of the women in the king's harem, but not for the queen. Maybe she was simply trying to demonstrate her own power and her own influence to the women she was entertaining at her own banquet, maybe to show them that she was very important and could wield her own influence in the kingdom. But rather than confronting the queen, the king turns to his advisors and asks them to tell him what to do. And the advisors, concerned that other wives, having seen Queen Vashti's denial of the king's request, would follow suit in their own households, creating an unmanageable situation throughout the kingdom. They suggest then that the king put forth a decree removing Vashti from her role as queen. The decree was intended to set an example for all the women of the kingdom. The king, not knowing what else to do, did as his advisors suggested. Essentially, we could see that the advisors turned what was a matter of personal disobedience into a national issue. And the consequence for Vashti? She was removed from her position of power and never heard from again. So what are we to make of this introduction to the book of Esther? Well, we saw that some of it was attempting to set a historical setting for the entire story. But I think we have to be careful not to read Esther through the lens of today's world. I doubt the author was implying that Queen Vashti was trying to start a feminist movement in ancient Persia, or that she was addressing what we today would call the Me Too movement and seeking to give people vision of what might be happening to the women of the kingdom. More likely, she was asserting her personal power in an attempt to manipulate her husband for her own purposes. As we will see, Esther, in her turn as queen, takes a different path, a subtle path that will better serve her purposes as queen of Persia. The overreaction of the king to Vashti's refusal, I think, undermines his power, the very opposite of what it is he's trying to demonstrate to the officials and the people in Persia through all of his parties and celebrations. That very power that he tried to exert, that he used and displayed his wealth by turning to others for help in solving his domestic dilemma, the king demonstrates his lack of power through his inability to decide on a course of action. You see, true power requires wisdom as well as the skill to use it properly. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, we can see King Solomon as an example of one who had the wisdom and skill to use his power effectively and in a godly way. That's why he's held up as such an example of one who knows how to do what God asks him to do. Well, of course, the theme of power is only one of the storylines in the book of Esther, but its thread weaves its way throughout the events in the story of this young Jewish woman who becomes the queen of Persia. In the coming reflections, I will attempt to tease out some of the other themes in Esther's story. Next time, I'll look at chapter 2. In this chapter, we're introduced to Esther and to her cousin Mordecai, who is a key player in all that happens through the rest of the drama. And we also see how she rose to become the queen of Persia. So I invite you to join me in following the story of Queen Esther.